My husband of 40 years just handed me a glass of poison wine to steal my family's fortune. I watched him mark my glass with a red smudge so he wouldn't accidentally kill himself. I didn't scream or run, but to understand how I got here, I need to take you back to a rainy afternoon at Zuma. Topic Chapter 1. I watched my husband of 40 years kiss a blonde woman. She looked young enough to be his granddaughter. It was our Ruby anniversary. I was sitting at Zuma in downtown Miami. The air smelled of expensive soy sauce and Tom Ford cologne. I was waiting for a client to discuss a $50 million commercial lease. The math never lies in real estate. People are just like properties. The foundation tells the real story. I took a sip of my sparkling water. The condensation was freezing against my fingers. That's when I saw him, 2 tables away, tucked into a curved leather booth near the back. Langston. My Langston. He was wearing the custom charcoal suit I bought him for his birthday. The fabric looked sharp under the restaurant's amber lighting. She was sitting across from him. Her hair was perfectly blown out. She leaned across the table. He grabbed her face with both hands. And then he kissed her. It wasn't a friendly peck. It was hungry. It was desperate. My stomach dropped to the floor. A wave of physical nausea hit me so hard I couldn't breathe. I gripped the edge of the heavy teak table. The edges of my vision went completely dark. I could feel my heartbeat hammering violently in my throat. He pulled back slightly. His right hand slid down her bare shoulder. It settled right on the small of her back. His thumb stroked the fabric of her silk dress. My mind snapped back to 1984, a humid afternoon under a white floral arch. A young Langston was standing in front of me. He was sliding a heavy gold band onto my left ring finger. He looked me in the eyes. He promised me 50 years of absolute loyalty. I believed him. We were so young and naive. My phone buzzed on the table. The sudden vibration made me jump in my seat. I looked down at the screen. The lock screen lit up with a new iMessage. It was from a contact saved as Langston Hamd. The timestamp read 1014 p.m., exactly right now. The text read, "Happy 40th anniversary, mi amor." The next line said, "Stuck at the port with customs." It ended with, "Can't wait for tonight." I stared at the glowing letters. I looked right back up at the booth. He was smiling at her. He wasn't at the shipping port. He wasn't dealing with customs agents. He was right here. He was drinking a martini and lying to my face in real time. I just sat there frozen. The restaurant noise faded into a dull, echoing roar. The ice in my glass shifted and cracked loudly. 40 years, 4 decades of building a life. We built an empire and a family together. All of it felt like a collapsing building. I thought about my late father's estate in Punta, Cana. Langston had been asking a lot of questions about the trust lately. He wanted to know about the deed transfers. I had brushed it off as normal financial planning. Now a cold spike of paranoia pierced through my chest. Who was this blonde woman? Was she just a mistress? Or was she something much worse? I watched them for exactly 3 more minutes. I timed it on my Cartier watch. He poured her more white wine. She laughed and touched his wrist. I memorized the sharp angle of her jaw. I memorized the calculating way she looked at him. She didn't look like a cheap fling. She looked like a business partner. She looked like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. My hands finally stopped shaking. A strange, breezing calm washed over my entire body. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my drink. I just took a photo, paid my tab, and realized I didn't know the man I'd slept next to for 14,000 nights. I sat in the driver's seat of my Mercedes. I was staring blankly at the photo I had just taken. The screen of my phone felt hot in my palm. Langston and the blonde woman, smiling, plotting. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the Zuma parking lot. The Miami sun was blinding. I drove back to our Brickell penthouse in complete silence. The air conditioning blasted against my face. It didn't stop the cold sweat on the back of my neck. The elevator doors opened directly into our private foyer. The apartment was dead silent. The floor-to-ceiling windows showed the gray, choppy water of Biscayne Bay. I walked into the kitchen. I dropped my keys heavily onto the cold marble island. My phone buzzed against the stone. Another text from Langston. The text said, "Don't forget our reservations tonight at 8. Love you." Tonight? Our 40th anniversary dinner. My stomach violently twisted. Next to my keys sat a crumpled white bakery box. I had picked up almond croissants from the bakery yesterday morning. Langston had taken one single bite. He immediately spit it into a paper napkin. He had practically yelled at me in this very kitchen. He complained intensely about a sharp, bitter almond taste. He said it tasted like pure poison. I ended up throwing the whole box in the trash. Now, staring at the empty counter, his aggressive overreaction felt deeply strange. His nerves were completely frayed, but I had bigger problems than his sudden temper tantrums. I walked straight down the long hallway. I went directly into his home office. The room smelled overwhelmingly of his expensive Tom Ford cologne. It masked the scent of old leather and dust. I sat down in his heavy mahogany desk chair. I booted up his desktop computer. People are just like properties. The foundation tells the real story. If Langston was hiding a woman, he was hiding money. I needed hard numbers. I opened the bottom right drawer of his desk. It was locked, of course, but I knew the spare key was taped under the middle drawer. I retrieved the small silver key. I turned the lock with a sharp click. I pulled out a thick, unmarked manila folder. It was deliberately buried under a heavy stack of old 2018 tax returns. Inside was a Joint Chase Sapphire bank statement. I ran my index finger down the long column of printed charges. My breath caught sharply in my throat. There it was, a $10,000 withdrawal. The merchant was listed simply as Apex Solutions. I quickly flipped to the previous month's statement. Another $10,000 gone. Wired directly to Apex Solutions. I checked the specific dates. The massive withdrawal started exactly 6 months ago, November, the exact same month my father passed away in Punta, Cana. A memory hit me like a physical blow. I was standing in the humid cemetery. The dark mahogany casket was lowering into the ground. The smell of white lilies was suffocating. Langston was standing right beside me. I remembered his heavy hand gripping my shoulder. I had looked up at him for comfort. He was staring blankly at the wooden casket. His face was completely devoid of grief. It was just a cold, calculating mask. I dropped the paper bank statement onto the leather desk mat. My hands went completely cold. I could feel my heartbeat hammering in my throat. Rising panic clawed at my chest. $10,000 a month. $60,000 total. This wasn't coming from his corporate salary. This specific account was tied directly to my father's estate trust. I picked up my phone. I opened the photo from the restaurant again. The math never lies. The foundation of my 40-year marriage was completely rotting beneath my feet. What exactly is Apex Solutions? A corporate shell company? A retainer for his blonde accomplice? He wasn't just buying a girl expensive dinners. He was draining my father's legacy. And I was going to find out exactly where every single cent went. Topic Chapter 3. I aligned the edges of the Chase Sapphire bank statements perfectly. I slipped them back inside the unmarked manila folder. I placed the 2018 tax returns exactly over the top. The math never lies, but the presentation has to look completely untouched. I locked the desk drawer with the small silver key. I slipped the key deep into my pocket. My hands were freezing. My mind was racing with one name. Apex Solutions. $10,000 a month, bleeding out of my father's estate. I needed to know who was cashing those checks. At 7:15 p.m., the heavy oak front door of the penthouse clicked open. Langston walked into the foyer. He was wearing his custom charcoal suit. He carried a massive bouquet of white lilies, my father's funeral flowers. The irony was sickening. Langston smiled that perfect, practiced smile. He kissed my cheek. The sharp scent of his expensive Tom Ford cologne made my stomach turn. He looked right into my eyes. He said, "Happy 40th anniversary, my love." I forced my facial muscles to lift into a smile. I said, "I can't wait for dinner." He loosened his silk tie. He told me our reservation at Zuma was exactly at 8. He said he needed a quick shower to wash off the day. I stood alone in the sterile, neon-lit kitchen. I listened to his heavy footsteps echo down the hall. I pulled out my phone. I opened the penthouse security app. I clicked on the hallway camera feed. The timestamp in the corner reads 7:45 p.m. I watched Langston walk toward the master bathroom. He was still smiling on the video feed, but the second the bathroom door closed behind him, his face went completely dead. The loving husband mask just vanished. It was chilling. I heard the shower water turn on. I had maybe 10 minutes before he came out. I grabbed his car keys from the heavy teak console table. I slipped out the front door. I took the private elevator straight down to the luxury parking garage. The garage was humid and smelled like stale exhaust. His black Mercedes was parked in its usual spot. I unlocked the doors and slid into the passenger seat. The leather upholstery was still warm. I opened the glove box. I found registration papers, insurance cards, and a few napkins. It looked completely standard. But people are just like properties. The foundation tells the real story. I ran my fingers along the top plastic panel inside the glove box. I felt a tiny recessed latch. I pressed it hard. A hidden compartment dropped down over my knees. My heart hammered against my ribs. Inside the compartment was a tightly rolled black microfiber cloth. I pulled it out and unrolled it on my lap. 2 items were hidden inside: a cheap plastic prepaid burner phone and a small black Garmin GPS receiver. I picked up the Garmin. The screen lit up instantly. It displayed a live glowing map of downtown Miami. There was a blinking red dot right on Brickell Avenue. I tapped the device settings with a shaking finger. I checked the paired tracking beacon. The beacon was registered under the name Cayenne. My car? He had planted a physical tracker on my Porsche Cayenne. Icy terror washed over me. I couldn't breathe. The damp air in the garage felt suffocating. Why did he need to track my every single move? He already knew my daily schedule. He knew I was out appraising commercial properties all day. What was he really planning with Apex Solutions? Have you ever realized the person sleeping next to you is a complete stranger? I stared at the blinking red dot on the screen. The truth hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't just a wife being cheated on, I was a target being hunted. And my husband was the one holding the crosshairs. Topic Chapter 4. The red dot on that Garmin screen blinked like a warning siren. I had exactly 4 minutes before Langston's shower ended. My hand shook violently. I shoved the burner phone and the GPS receiver back into the hidden compartment. I tucked the black microfiber cloth over them. I slammed the plastic door shut. It clicked perfectly into place. I sprinted across the luxury parking garage. My heels echoed sharply against the concrete. I slammed my palm against the elevator button. The door slid open at the penthouse level. I rushed into our foyer. I dropped his car keys onto the heavy teak console table. The metal jingled against the wood. A second later, the water shut off in the master bathroom. I closed my eyes and swallowed the bile in my throat. By 8 o'clock, we were sitting at a corner table at Zuma. Downtown Miami glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Langston raised his martini glass to clink against my white wine. He smiled his perfect practice smile. "Happy 40 years, my love," he said. The smell of his Tom Ford cologne drifted across the table. It made my stomach turn. I smiled back and ate my sea bass. I played the role of the oblivious, adoring wife. Every time he checked his phone, I pictured that blinking red dot. It was 2:15 a.m. when I finally slipped out of bed. The penthouse was pitch black. Langston shifted under the silk sheets. His hand reached out and grabbed my wrist. My blood turned to ice. "Can't sleep," he mumbled in the dark. I told him I was just getting water. He pulled me closer. "I was thinking," he whispered. "We need to upgrade the smart home security system." He stroked the back of my hand. "I want internal motion sensors installed tomorrow, just to keep you safe while I travel." Safe? He wanted to track my movements inside my own home. I forced a laugh and agreed. By 3 a.m., I was locked inside my home office. The heavy oak door was bolted shut. I booted up my desktop computer. The screen cast a harsh blue light across the room. My appraisal career gives me certain privileges. You know exactly where the bodies are buried. I logged into the Miami-Dade County Public Property Records portal. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I searched for Apex Solutions. I hit enter. The database loaded a single PDF document. I clicked the link. Have you ever looked at a document and felt your soul leave your body? It was a quitclaim deed. The property address listed was my late father's estate in Punta, Cana. The grantee was Apex Solutions. I scrolled down to the bottom of the digital page. There it was. My signature perfectly executed in blue ink. My vision blurred. I gripped the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles turned white. A memory hit me like a physical blow. 1 month ago, we were sitting right here in the kitchen. Langston handed me a Mont Blanc pen over our morning coffee. He said they were just routine tax documents for the trust. His large hand had casually covered the bottom half of the pages. I had signed them without looking. I trusted him. He had literally stolen my family's beachfront inheritance right in front of my face. Apex Solutions wasn't just a retainer for his blonde accomplice, it was a corporate shell holding my stolen land. The math never lies. People are just like properties. The foundation tells the real story. And Langston's foundation was pure rot. I sat in the glow of the monitor. The silence of the penthouse felt suffocating. He wasn't leaving me for another woman. He was taking everything I owned before he left. I needed someone who understood the digital shadows. I needed Mateo. Topic Chapter 5. I stared at the glowing monitor in my dark office. It was exactly 3:14 a.m. I had to get back to bed. If Langston woke up and found me here, it was over. I shut down the desktop computer. I wiped the keyboard with my sleeve. My hands were ice cold. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I crept down the long hallway. The penthouse was dead silent. The hardwood floor felt freezing against my bare feet. I slipped back under the heavy silk sheets. Langston shifted in his sleep. He rolled over and threw his arm across my waist. He smelled like expensive Tom Ford cologne and peppermint toothpaste. I lay there completely rigid in the dark. Tomorrow morning, his security team was coming. They were installing internal motion sensors. He claimed it was an upgrade for my safety. I stared up at the ceiling corners where the sensors would go. In real estate, we call that fencing the perimeter. He was building my cage. At 9 a.m. the next morning, I walked out of our luxury parking garage. I left my Porsche Cayenne parked in its spot. That black Garmin tracking beacon was still magnetically stuck underneath the chassis. Let him think I was upstairs drinking my morning espresso. I hailed a yellow cab on Brickell Avenue instead. I told the driver to take me straight to Little Havana. I watched the glass skyscrapers fade into colorful storefronts. I needed my nephew. Mateo is 24 years old. He wears oversized hoodies and lives behind 3 computer monitors. He does elite cybersecurity for a major logistics firm downtown. We met at Versailles Restaurant on Calle Ocho. The diner was absolutely packed. The smell of roasted pork hit me instantly. The rich aroma of strong Cuban coffee hung in the humid air. Plates were clattering loudly. Waiters were shouting orders in rapid Spanish. It was the perfect chaotic place to hide in plain sight. Mateo was sitting in a back corner booth. His silver laptop was already open on the sticky Formica table. I slid into the green vinyl seat across from him. He looked up at my face and immediately stopped typing. "Tia, what's wrong?" he asked. His voice was laced with concern. I didn't waste a single second. I slid a folded white napkin across the table. I had written Langston's prepaid burner phone number in blue ink. "I need everything on this number," I said. "And I need it right now." Mateo didn't ask any pointless questions. He just took the napkin. His fingers started flying rapidly across his mechanical keyboard. Lines of green code began scrolling down his black screen. A waitress dropped off a cortadito. The tiny paper cup burned my fingertips. I took a sip. The bitter espresso tasted like ash in my mouth. Every single time the diner door opened, my breath caught. I kept expecting Langston to walk in wearing his custom charcoal suit. Paranoia is a heavy, suffocating garment to wear. 20 agonizing minutes passed. The math never lies, but waiting for it is absolute torture. Suddenly, Mateo stopped typing. His jaw tightened visibly. "I bypassed the carrier firewall," he muttered. He pointed at the screen. "He has a hidden, secure folder." Mateo hit one final key. A new window popped up on his monitor. It was the digital screenshot of a banking application. I leaned over the heavy table. The glare from the overhead lights hit the screen. It was a wire transfer confirmation. The amount was exactly $50,000. The recipient name was listed in bold letters. Blythe Vance. I traced the name on the screen with my index finger. People are just like properties. The foundation tells the real story. Below the massive dollar amount was a short memo line. It read, "Consulting, Phase 1, Phase 1. My stomach dropped straight to the floor. If $50,000 was just Phase 1, what was Phase 2? "Is she a consultant for Apex Solutions?" I asked. Mateo didn't answer me right away. He opened another secure tab and ran her name. I watched his face closely. The color completely drained from his cheeks. His dark eyes went wide behind his glasses. He looked utterly terrified. "My nephew breaks into corporate servers for fun." He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "He does not scare easily." Have you ever watched someone you love realize you're in mortal danger? My hands started shaking. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. Mateo pushed the laptop toward me. His fingers were trembling against the metal casing. "Tia," he whispered, "Blythe isn't a model. She's a dark web facilitator. She specializes in untraceable toxins." Top at Chapter 6. Untraceable toxins. The words hung in the stale air of the diner. Mateo's dark eyes were wide with genuine fear. I stared at him. My hands gripped the sticky Formica table so hard my knuckles ached. My blood turned to ice water. Suddenly, a memory slammed into my chest. 2 weeks ago, I was standing at the kitchen island. Langston handed me an almond croissant from that crumbled white bakery box. I took one bite. It tasted sharp, bitter, like pure chemical extract. My tongue went completely numb. He slapped it out of my hand so fast his coffee spilled across the marble. He actually yelled at me. He said it was a bad batch. He threw the whole box down the trash chute immediately. Bitter almond. The classic scent of cyanide. He was already testing doses on me, checking my physical reaction, seeing exactly what he could get away with. My stomach lurched. I checked my Cartier watch. It was 9:14 a.m. Langston was scheduled to meet the security technicians at the penthouse at 10. They were installing internal motion sensors today, 4 of them in the main hallways. He wanted a digital cage to track my every move indoors. He claimed it was for my safety. A lie, of course. I had to get back before they arrived. I left Mateo with a quick, desperate hug. I hailed a yellow cab on Calle Ocho. I couldn't take my Porsche. The black Garmin tracking beacon was still underneath it. If Langston checked the app, my car was safely parked in our luxury garage. The cab dropped me 2 blocks from our building. I slipped through the service elevator. The penthouse was empty. The Tom Ford cologne lingered heavily in the foyer. I was safe. For now. But I needed to verify the foundation of his plan. At 11 a.m., I walked into the Bank of America on Brickell Avenue. The marble floors echoed under my heels. I needed to check my safe deposit box. Box number 412. 2 months ago, Langston asked to borrow my spare brass key. He smiled that charming, devastating smile of his. He said he needed to store his grandmother's vintage watch. I handed it over without a second thought, a fatal appraisal error on my part. The bank manager escorted me into the sterile, fluorescent-lit vault. The heavy steel door locked behind us with a loud thud. The air down there was freezing. It smelled like dust and old money. He left me alone in the private viewing room. I slid the long metal drawer onto the heavy teak table. The metal scraped loudly against the wood. I flipped the lid open. My breath caught in my throat. The original deeds to my father's Punta Cana estate were gone. The thick parchment folders, the blue wax seals, all missing. Only one piece of paper remained inside the hollow steel box, a single crisp white sheet. I picked it up. My fingers were trembling so violently the paper rattled. It was a notarized letter of authorization. It granted Apex Solutions full access to the box's contents. My signature was at the bottom, forged perfectly in blue ink. Have you ever looked at your own handwriting and known you didn't write it? It makes your skin crawl, but that wasn't what made the room spin. I looked at the raised black notary stamp in the bottom corner. The name was pressed perfectly into the paper. Blythe Vance, State of Florida. Everything clicked into place. That passionate kiss I photographed at Zuma, it wasn't a lover's embrace. It was a public transaction. He was sealing a deadly contract with his dark web chemist. She wasn't a mistress. She was a fixer, a professional ghost. And she was liquidating my family's legacy right under my nose. The math never lies. People are just like properties. The foundation tells the real story. They had my land. They had my money. But as I stared at that forged stamp, I realized they needed one more thing to cash out. My death certificate. I left the forged notarized letter exactly where I found it. I couldn't risk Blythe noticing it was moved. I slid the thick parchment folder back into the long metal drawer. I locked box 412 with the spare brass key. I walked out of the Bank of America on Brickell Avenue. The heavy glass doors shut behind me. My heels clicked loudly against the polished marble floor. I felt completely hollow. My death certificate was the final piece of their sick puzzle. I needed to get out of there. I took the elevator down to the luxury parking garage. I got into my Porsche Cayenne. The black leather seat burned against my skin. The Florida heat was suffocating. The air conditioning blasted, but I was sweating. It was 11:42 a.m. I checked the dashboard clock twice to be sure. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Then the cheap plastic prepaid burner phone vibrated in the center console. I picked it up. Mateo had sent a message to my secure Proton Mail account. I opened the encrypted app with my thumbprint. The screen illuminated the dark interior of the car. It was a forwarded email screenshot. Mateo had successfully bypassed Langston's primary inbox. I stared at the bright white pixels. My chest felt incredibly tight. The corporate logo at the top read, Mutual of Omaha Life Insurance. It was a policy activation confirmation. The insured party was me. The sole beneficiary was Apex Solutions. People are just like properties. The foundation tells the real story. The base payout was $5 million. I felt a cold, calculating survival instinct kick in. I pinched the screen to zoom in on the fine print. There it was, a double indemnity clause for accidental death. $10 million if I died in a sudden, tragic mishap. But there was a strict deadline attached to the activation window. The policy required the accidental death to occur before the end of the fiscal month. I looked at the calendar on my phone. The fiscal month ended this Sunday. Have you ever looked back at a happy memory and realized it was actually a trap? 3 weeks ago, Langston insisted on hosting a lavish 40th anniversary party. We were standing in the kitchen by the heavy teak island. He was overly enthusiastic. He was ordering cases of expensive Bordeaux wine on his silver laptop. He meticulously finalized a guest list of 50 influential friends. I thought he was just being romantic. I was so incredibly stupid. He wasn't planning a celebration. He was setting the stage for a tragic accident with 50 credible witnesses. I put the burner phone back in my pocket. I drove straight back to our building. I parked the Cayenne in our designated spot. I rode the private elevator up to the penthouse. The stainless steel doors slid open. I stepped into the marble foyer. The air immediately smelled like his expensive Tom Ford cologne. I looked up at the ceiling crown molding. There they were. 4 brand new internal motion sensors. They were sleek, black, and completely silent. A tiny red LED light blinked on the nearest one. The second sensor was mounted above the heavy teak console table. The third was right outside the master bedroom. The fourth covered the kitchen island. My digital cage was officially installed. He was now tracking my every physical step inside my own home. I took a deep, shaky breath. I walked directly past the first sensor in the main hallway. I forced my posture to remain relaxed. I kept my face perfectly blank. I walked into the master bathroom and turned on the faucet. The cold water rushed over my heavy gold band. I stared at my reflection in the massive vanity mirror. The math never lies. The anniversary party was this Saturday night. That was his strict deadline. The double indemnity clause required a highly visible accident. A tragic slip over the penthouse balcony railing. A deadly allergic reaction to a bitter almond croissant masked by expensive wine. My husband was going to murder me at our anniversary party, surrounded by our friends. He thought I was the prey. He was about to find out I am the predator. Topic Chapter 8. I dragged my black leather overnight bag from the top shelf of the master closet. The zipper caught, and my hands were shaking so hard I almost ripped it. It was exactly 11:45 a.m. Langston was supposedly at a commercial zoning board meeting until 3 o'clock. I had 3 hours to disappear without a trace. I threw 3 silk blouses, a pair of slacks, and my passport into the bag. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My throat felt completely dry. The plan was simple and clinical. I would take a yellow cab straight to Mateo's apartment in Little Havana. From his cramped living room, I would call the Miami FBI field office. I would hand them the forged notary letter. I would give them the joint Chase Sapphire bank statements showing the Apex Solutions transfers. I walked out of the master bedroom and into the kitchen. The white marble floor was freezing cold against my bare feet. I sat at the heavy teak island. I pulled out a sheet of thick cream stationery and Langston's silver Mont Blanc pen. I wrote a single devastating sentence. I know about Apex Solutions, and I know about Blythe. I left the note right next to his expensive espresso machine. He would see it the second he walked in. I grabbed my bag and walked down the main hallway toward the penthouse foyer. That is when I noticed the blinking red lights. Langston had been busy this morning before he left. 4 new internal motion sensors were mounted in the upper corners of the ceiling. Their sleek white plastic casings blended perfectly into the crown molding. I pulled out my phone and opened our penthouse security app. I tapped on the living room camera feed. The screen showed a live, high-definition feed of me standing there with my suitcase. Every time I shifted my weight, a tiny red LED flashed on the nearest sensor. He was tracking my exact movements inside my own home. A digital cage built just for me. My fingers tightened around the thick leather handle of my bag. I stared at the heavy mahogany front door. Freedom was exactly 10 steps away, but my feet felt like they were cast in solid concrete. I closed my eyes. The sterile smell of the penthouse air conditioning completely faded. Suddenly, I was back in Punta Cana. It was the humid summer of 1995. The salty ocean breeze was whipping fiercely across my face. My father was standing next to me on our private beach. He reached down and scooped up a handful of wet white sand. He pressed it firmly into my palm and closed my fingers over it. I can still feel those coarse grains digging into my skin today. He looked me dead in the eye. He said, "Ixio Mara, people will always try to buy what they cannot build." He told me to never surrender our Dominican soil. I opened my eyes. I was back in the suffocating, neon-lit glare of downtown Miami. I looked down at the suitcase in my hand. If I walked out that door, I was handing Langston the keys to the kingdom. A divorce would tie the estate up in vicious litigation for a decade. He and Blythe already had the forged quitclaim deed. They had Apex Solutions perfectly positioned to absorb the assets. Fleeing didn't solve the math. The math never lies. People are just like properties. The foundation tells the real story. Langston's foundation was pure greed. If I ran, he would just hire someone to finish the job quietly. A staged car accident on I-95. A fatal mugging in an alleyway. I would be looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life. My father's legacy would be paved over for cheap tourist resorts. I let go of the suitcase. The heavy bag hit the hardwood floor with a loud, echoing thud. A surge of righteous burning heat rushed in my veins. I walked back into the kitchen. I picked up the cream stationery note. I tore it into tiny, jagged pieces and threw them in the trash. I walked back to the foyer and grabbed my bag. The motion sensor blinked red again as I moved. Let him watch. Let him think I was just doing laundry or organizing closets. I dragged the bag back into the master bedroom. I threw it onto the heavy silk sheets. I unzipped the main compartment. If I ran, he won. He'd find another way to take the land. I unpacked my bag. If Langston wanted a funeral this weekend, I was going to give him one. Topic Chapter 9. The 4 motion sensors in my hallway went live at exactly 8 a.m. I knew because my phone buzzed with the activation alert. The sleek white plastic casings were mounted in every corner. Langston thought he was building me a digital cage. He forgot that I hold the master keys to this property. I walked into the kitchen. The marble floor was cold against my bare feet. The torn cream stationery note was still sitting in the trash. I couldn't leave it exposed. I carefully buried it under a mound of wet espresso grounds. I wiped my hands on a folded white napkin. The smell of bitter coffee filled the room. If he wanted a surveillance war, he was going to get one. I left the penthouse at 8:30. I didn't go straight to the office. I drove my Porsche to a specialty electronics shop on Calle Ocho. The store smelled like ozone and cheap plastic. I paid $500 in cash for a 4K hidden camera. It was seamlessly built into a fake potted white orchid. The leaves felt like real silicone. The ceramic base was heavy. It was a beautiful, deceptive little object. I drove back to the Brickell penthouse immediately. I walked through the front door. The new hallway sensors flashed red as I walked past them. Let him track my movements. Let him think I was just fetching a forgotten file. I carried the orchid straight into his dark mahogany study. The room always smelled like his expensive Tom Ford cologne. I set the plant on the top shelf of his bookcase. I angled the tiny lens perfectly toward his heavy leather desk chair. It blended in flawlessly. By 10 o'clock, I was sitting at my desk at Brickell Property Group. My office door was locked. The air conditioning hummed above me. I propped my iPad up against my computer monitor. The live feed from the orchid was crystal clear. I spent the morning appraising a commercial high-rise in Wynwood. I crunched the numbers. The math never lies, but my eyes kept darting back to the iPad screen. Have you ever watched someone walking around inside your own trap? It gives you a very specific kind of power. At exactly 2:15 p.m., the motion alert chimed on my tablet. The heavy mahogany door of the study swung open. Langston walked in wearing his custom charcoal suit. He wasn't alone. Blythe walked in right behind him. My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. She was standing in my sanctuary. I watched her run her manicured fingers over my grandmother's vintage desk. The territorial disgust tasted like copper in my mouth. She didn't stay in the study for long. She opened the heavy glass doors and stepped out onto the penthouse balcony. I switched my iPad to the outdoor security camera feed. The afternoon sun was blindingly bright. Blythe leaned against the glass railing. She pulled a lighter from her pocket and lit a cigarette. She exhaled a long plume of gray smoke. The wind caught her blonde hair. She looked out over the downtown Miami skyline. She looked exactly like a woman who believed she already owned it. People are just like properties. The foundation tells the real story. Her foundation was pure, unadulterated greed. Langston joined her on the balcony a minute later. He handed her a crystal glass of sparkling water. They didn't kiss. They didn't touch. This wasn't a romantic afternoon rendezvous. This was a board meeting for my murder. They stepped back inside the study. I switched the feed back to the hidden orchid camera. Langston sat down in his heavy leather chair. Blythe stood on the opposite side of the desk. She unclasped her expensive black leather purse. She reached inside and pulled something out. My hands went completely numb. I leaned closer to the iPad screen. She held out a small, unmarked glass vial. The liquid inside was perfectly clear. Langston reached across the dark wood to take it. I zoomed in on the vial in my husband's hand. I didn't need to read lips to know what it was, but I needed to hear the audio to know his exact timeline. Top it. Chapter 10. I couldn't just watch that clear liquid swishing inside a silent glass vial. I needed to hear the exact timeline of my own murder. At 12:15 p.m., I walked out of my Brickell office. I told my receptionist I had an emergency site inspection in Wynwood. It was a lie to maintain my alibi. I left my personal cell phone sitting on my mahogany desk. I left my Porsche Cayenne parked in the luxury garage downstairs. Langston was still monitoring that Garmin tracking beacon. Let him stare at his screen and think I was working. I walked 3 blocks down Brickell Avenue in the blistering heat. The humidity was suffocating. I hailed a yellow cab and paid the driver $50 in cash. I told him to take me to Little Havana. Mateo's apartment building was a decaying stucco complex on Calle Ocho. The hallway smelled like cheap weed and damp carpet. Mateo opened his door before I even knocked. His living room was a dark cave of glowing screens. 3 massive computer monitors sat on a sticky Formica table. Empty energy drink cans were scattered across the floor. I handed him the iPad. My hands were shaking so hard the screen rattled against his desk. I told him I needed the audio from the hidden study camera. Mateo didn't ask a single question. He just typed furiously on his mechanical keyboard. Code cascaded down his left monitor like green rain. I stood behind him, watching his reflection in the dark glass. 10 minutes passed in absolute agonizing silence. The digital clock on his desk flipped to 1004 p.m. Then, a jagged green audio waveform appeared on the center screen. Mateo handed me a pair of heavy black headphones. The leather earpads felt ice cold against my sweating skin. I slid them on and gave him a curt nod. Mateo pressed the spacebar. First, I heard the faint, familiar hum of the penthouse air conditioning. Then, I heard the sharp clink of ice dropping into a crystal glass. Finally, I heard my husband's voice. It was crisp, relaxed, and perfectly clear. The new motion sensors are live, Langston said. She won't be able to sneeze in that hallway without us knowing. Blythe's voice chimed in next. Her tone was sickeningly sweet, like rotting fruit. And the Phase 2 timeline? She asked. Saturday night, Langston replied, during the anniversary toast. I gripped the edge of Mateo's folding table. The cheap plastic dug painfully into my palms. Are you sure she'll drink it? Blythe asked. Langston actually laughed. It was a deep, warm chuckle that made my stomach heave. Xiomara is a creature of sentiment, he said. She's completely predictable. A cold snap of absolute hatred froze my blood. 40 years of devotion reduced to a punchline for his mistress. I'll pour the 1984 Bordeaux, Langston continued. The heavy tannins will completely mask the bitter taste. He paused and I heard the unmistakable clinking of the small glass vial. She'll be dead before dessert. I closed my eyes and stopped breathing. My mind violently pulled me back to a charity auction in 2015. We were standing in a brilliantly lit ballroom at the Biltmore Hotel. Langston had just bid $5,000 on that exact bottle of Bordeaux. I remembered the heavy scent of his expensive Tom Ford cologne. I remembered the warmth of his hand resting on my waist. He had kissed my cheek right there in front of 200 people. He looked deep into my eyes and smiled that perfect practice smile. "We'll open this when we turn 40, he had whispered. He didn't mean our biological age. He meant our 40th wedding anniversary. It was supposed to be our ultimate romantic milestone. Now, I knew it was a premeditated execution date. I ripped the headphones off my ears. They clattered onto the desk, still leaking the tinny sound of Blythe's giggles. Mateo stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. He had routed the audio through the laptop's speakers, too. He had heard every single word. "Auntie Theo," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They're going to kill you on Saturday." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared at that jagged green audio wave frozen on the monitor. The math never lies. People are just like properties. The Foundation tells the real story. Langston had built this entire murder plot on a faulty foundation. He assumed I was just a blind, sentimental old woman. He was going to use our wedding year vintage to kill me. It was a beautifully poetic plan. But Langston forgot one crucial detail about me. I control the wine cellar. Tactic Chapter 11. I left the dark study and walked straight out of the penthouse. I needed my phone and my car. Both were still sitting at my Brickell Avenue office. I hailed a yellow cab on the street. The leather seat was sticky and smelled like stale tobacco. It was a far cry from the suffocating smell of expensive men's cologne and Langston's Mercedes. The dashboard clock read 10:15 p.m. By 1:28 p.m., I was back at my desk. My phone was exactly where I left it, next to my keyboard. I tapped the screen. No missed calls from Langston. My digital alibi was perfectly intact. I grabbed my keys and headed down to the luxury parking garage. I drove the Porsche Cayenne back to the penthouse. I walked through the heavy mahogany front door. I stopped dead in the main hallway. I stared up at the ceiling. There it was, one of the 4 new motion sensors, a sleek white plastic casing with a tiny blinking green light. Langston said he installed them to keep me safe while he traveled. That was a lie. The math never lies. People are just like properties. The Foundation tells the real story. I looked at the sensor outside the master bathroom. Then I looked at the one pointing toward the kitchen. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. He didn't just want to track my movements. He was building a digital alibi. I pulled out my phone and opened the smart home app. The screen displayed the 4 new sensor zones. Living room, kitchen, master bedroom, hallway. If I dropped dead on Saturday, the police would check these exact logs. The system would show Langston safely in the kitchen. It would show me alone in the living room. He would have digital proof he was nowhere near my glass. It was brilliantly ruthless. I opened my contacts and called Mateo. He answered on the first ring. I could hear him typing frantically on a mechanical keyboard. I told him about the 4 motion sensors. I asked if he could manipulate the logs for Saturday night. He went completely silent. Then Mateo spoke. He said, "Auntie, they're basic infrared sensors connected to the local network." He said, "I can spoof the MAC address and loop the feed." I smiled. I told them to make sure the logs showed Langston in the living room with me, not the kitchen. Mateo breathed heavily into the receiver. I heard 3 sharp clicks of his mouse. He said, "Done. The loop is ready to trigger on your command." A wave of triumphant relief washed over me. My hands finally stopped shaking. I thanked him and hung up. You know that feeling when your gut is screaming at you, but your brain keeps making excuses? I was finally done making excuses. At 4:15 p.m., my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a notification from the Ring camera app. I opened the doorbell cam footage. A delivery driver in a brown uniform was standing on my welcome mat. He was holding a wooden crate. I walked to the front door and signed for it. I carried the heavy pine box to the kitchen island. I pried off the lid with a silver butter knife. Inside, resting on a bed of wood shavings, was the bottle. A 1984 Bordeaux. The exact vintage from our wedding year. The year my father celebrated our union by expanding the estate in Punta Cana. The heavy tannins were specifically chosen to mask the bitter almond taste of cyanide. I picked up the bottle by its dusty neck. The glass felt cold against my palm. I walked down the narrow hallway to the climate-controlled wine cellar. The air inside was 55 degrees. It smelled like damp oak and expensive cork. Langston's plan relied on opening this exact bottle during his toast. He would pour the glasses in the kitchen. He would slip the clear liquid into mine. But I control the inventory in this cellar. I walked over to the back wall. I placed the 1984 Bordeaux on the top mahogany rack. I reached into my black leather purse. I pulled out the small glass vial the poison Blythe had procured. I set it next to the vintage bottle. The amber lighting caught the edge of the glass. I stared at the two items on the mahogany rack. The wine meant to hide the poison. The toxin meant to stop my heart. I picked up the glass vial and slipped it into my pocket. Langston thought he controlled every variable in this house. He forgot who actually manages the assets. I turned off the cellar lights and walked away. The digital alibi he built to protect himself was now a digital noose. All I had to do was make sure he drank from the right glass. I walked out of the climate-controlled wine cellar. The small glass vial felt heavy in my blazer pocket. It was 5:15 p.m. on Friday. I had exactly 26 hours until the anniversary party. I went straight upstairs to the master closet. The 4 new motion sensors hadn't been activated yet. I needed to check everything before my digity cage locked me in. The closet smelled faintly of his expensive Tom Ford cologne. I hated that smell now. I started with Langston's dry cleaning pile. I ran my hands over his custom charcoal suit. The wool fabric was cold under my fingertips. My fingers caught on something in the inner breast pocket. A tiny crumpled piece of thermal paper. I pulled it out and smoothed it flat on the marble island. It was a crypto ATM receipt. The ink was slightly faded, but the numbers were clear. The timestamp was from exactly 3 weeks ago. The amount was $15,000. Converted instantly to Bitcoin. The destination address was flagged with a QR code. It was a direct transfer to a dark web escrow service. My stomach turned over. I gripped the cold edge of the marble counter. My heart was pounding against my ribs. Suddenly, a memory hit me like a physical blow. 1 week ago, right downstairs at the kitchen island, I had brought home a crumpled white bakery box from Wynwood. It was filled with fresh almond croissants. Langston took one bite of his pastry. He immediately spat it into a folded white napkin. His face went completely pale. He looked at me with wild, panicked eyes. He said, "What is wrong with this? It tastes like pure poison." He rushed to the kitchen sink. He frantically rinsed his mouth with cold tap water. I stood there holding my coffee cup, totally confused. I thought he was just being his usual dramatic, snobbish self. I told him it was just heavy almond paste. He said, "It's too bitter. It's disgusting. Throw them all away right now." Standing in the closet, the truth finally clicked into place. The math never lies. Cyanide is derived from a mingolin. It smells and tastes exactly like bitter almonds. He wasn't complaining about the bakery. He was testing his own senses. He had just finalized the purchase with Blythe. He was terrified of the toxin's potency. He needed to know if he could detect the lethal scent. He was making sure he wouldn't accidentally consume it himself. I pulled the glass vial from my pocket. I held the clear liquid up to the amber closet lighting. Tomorrow night, 50 credible witnesses will be in the Biltmore Hotel ballroom. The 1984 Bordeaux will be poured for our anniversary toast. The heavy tannins of the wine are meant to mask this bitter almond taste. That was his brilliant plan for my glass. But Langston's paranoia is his greatest weakness. People are just like properties. The foundation tells the real story. His foundation is pure cowardice. He is hyper-aware of that exact bitter almond scent. You know that feeling when a perfect plan suddenly hits a concrete wall? That was me, standing under those amber lights. I couldn't just swap our wine glasses tomorrow night. The second he raised my poison crystal glass to his lips, he would smell the almonds. He would drop the glass on the ballroom floor before ever taking a single sip. The hallway motion sensors would go live in a few hours. Mateo was standing by for my command to trigger the camera loop. Everything was perfectly in place for the party, but the murder weapon itself was useless for my counterattack. I gripped the tiny glass vial tightly in my fist. The cold glass dug sharply into my palm. He was terrified of accidentally poisoning himself, which meant if I swapped the glasses, he would smell the almonds. I needed a different poison for him. I had 26 hours until the anniversary dinner, and I needed a new weapon. I stared at the tiny glass vial in my hand. The cyanide was useless against him now. Langston was too paranoid about the bitter almond smell. He had tested his own sensitivity to it. If I used his own poison, he would notice immediately. I slipped a cold vial into my blazer pocket. I needed something he wouldn't detect. Something that would paralyze him, not kill him. Death was too easy for a man like Langston. I wanted him awake when his empire collapsed. At 5:30, I walked into my doctor's clinic on Brickell Avenue. The waiting room smelled like sterile alcohol and old magazines. I sat on the crinkly paper of the exam table. My heart was pounding against my ribs. I forced my hands to shake. I squeezed my eyes shut until real tears formed. Dr. Aris entered the room looking concerned. I told him I was having severe panic attacks. I said the stress of the 40th anniversary was breaking me. I told him I couldn't sleep. I told him I felt like I was suffocating. He nodded sympathetically. He handed me exactly what I needed, a prescription for a heavy, fast-acting liquid sedative. Flunitrazepam. Colorless, odorless, tasteless. It was perfect for blending into a heavy Bordeaux wine. I drove straight to the pharmacy on 8th Street. I paid cash for the small amber bottle. I slid it into my black leather purse next to the cyanide. By 6:15, I was sitting in a dark mahogany office in downtown Miami. The air conditioning hummed loudly against the thick glass windows. My estate lawyer, David, slid a thick stack of papers across his desk. The pages felt heavy in my hands. This was the real Counter-Strike. People are just like properties. The foundation tells the real story. Langston's foundation was my money. I picked up a silver Mont Blanc pen. I stared at the freshly signed last will and testament. It sat perfectly aligned on the mahogany desk. I flipped to page 3, clause 4. I read the words carefully. It completely revoked all previous claims by Langston. It left the Punta Cana estate in an ironclad blind trust. My father had built that estate with his bare hands. Langston thought he could just steal it with a forged notary stamp. He was wrong. I also signed the durable power of attorney. I named Mateo as my sole proxy. If anything happened to me, Mateo controlled everything. Apex Solutions would get absolutely nothing. Their forged quitclaim deed was now legally worthless. I pressed the pen down hard for my final signature. Blue ink bled slightly into the thick parchment. A wave of profound liberation washed over me. 40 years of marriage erased with 3 strokes of a pen. It felt better than any anniversary gift. I checked my Cartier watch. It was almost 7 o'clock. The 4 new hallway motion sensors were going live in exactly 1 hour. Langston was probably setting them up right now. I stood up and smoothed my silk skirt. I thanked David and walked out into the humid Miami evening. The sky was turning a bruised purple. Neon lights flickered on across Biscayne Bay. Langston thought he had me backed into a corner. He thought his digital cage would trap me. He didn't realize I was the one locking the door. Tomorrow night, 50 guests would fill the Biltmore Hotel ballroom. They would all be watching. They would all be witnesses. The paperwork was filed. The sedative was in my purse. The trap was fully set. Now the guests just needed to arrive. I made it back to the penthouse at exactly 7:42 p.m. on Friday, 18 minutes before Langston's new hallway motion sensors went live. I walked through the heavy mahogany front door. The air conditioning was freezing. I placed my black leather purse on the teak console table. The amber bottle of flunitrazepam was safe inside. I had beaten his digital cage. I poured myself a glass of cold tap water. My hands were perfectly steady. Now all I had to do was survive the party. 24 hours later, my living room was completely unrecognizable. It was Saturday night. 50 of Miami's elite were packed into my penthouse. The air smelled of expensive perfume and roasted duck canapes. Waiters in crisp white shirts carried silver trays of champagne. I was wearing my favorite emerald silk blouse. It draped perfectly over my shoulders. Langston was playing the role of the century. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a martini. He kept pulling me close by the waist. He kissed my cheek in front of the managing partners. His Tom Ford cologne made my stomach turn. I smiled so hard my jaw ached. People are just like properties. The foundation tells the real story, and his foundation was entirely rotten. At 8:30 p.m., the private elevator chimed. I turned toward the marble foyer. There she was, Blythe Vance, the dark web poisoner. She was wearing a sleek, black cocktail dress. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a tight bun. Langston waved her over to us immediately. He introduced her to the crowd as a new corporate consultant for Apex Solutions. My hands went ice cold. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I extended my hand. She took it. Her skin was warm. Her grip was firm. I was shaking the hand of the woman hired to kill me. I wanted to wrap my fingers around her throat. I wanted to scream the truth to the entire room. I smiled instead. I told her how lovely it was to finally meet her. Mateo was parked 3 stories down on Brickell Avenue. He was sitting in the back of a rented plumbing van. He had full access to the penthouse security feeds. My phone vibrated in my silk pocket. A single text message from Mateo. It said, "Balcony camera, look now." I slipped into the master bathroom and locked the heavy door. The marble tiles were cold through my heels. I pulled out my phone and opened the secure link. The outdoor security camera feed loaded instantly. Langston and Blythe were standing alone on the terrace. The neon lights of Biscayne Bay reflected in the glass behind them. Langston looked around, then tapped his Cartier watch. Blythe gave a subtle nod. Then she reached down and touched her black leather purse, right where the vial of cyanide was hiding. The timeline was locked. I walked back out into the crowded living room. It was exactly 9 p.m. I checked the hidden camera feed Mateo had installed in the kitchen. The screen showed Langston standing by the heavy teak island. He was holding the wooden crate, the 1984 Bordeaux. He carefully uncorked the bottle with a silver opener. The dark red liquid splashed into 2 crystal glasses. He was preparing my death sentence. I watched his hands on my glowing phone screen. They weren't shaking at all. He reached into his tuxedo jacket. This was it. The moment of truth. I had my own glass vial of flunitrazepam ready in my pocket. I just needed to execute the swap. When he noticed the glasses had been moved, he was terrified of the bitter almond scent. If I messed up the placement, he would know instantly. I stepped into the dining area. The crystal chandeliers cast a harsh light over the long table. The chatter of 50 guests echoed off the glass walls. Langston walked out of the kitchen. He was carrying the 2 glasses of Bordeaux. He handed the glass in his left hand directly to me. His fingers brushed mine. They were cold. He smiled that perfect hollow smile. Then he turned to the crowd. Langston clinked his spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The room went silent. It was time for the toast. It was time for me to die. Top of chapter 15. The sharp clink of a silver spoon against crystal cut through the room. 50 voices in our penthouse dining area instantly went dead silent. I stood frozen under the amber glow of the crystal chandeliers. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The air conditioning felt freezing against my bare shoulders. Langston smiled warmly at our guests. It was his perfect, practiced, loving husband smile. I had watched him rehearse that exact expression earlier this morning. He was standing in front of the massive vanity mirror in the master bathroom. He adjusted his silk tie and flashed a warm grin. Then he dropped the smile entirely. His eyes went dead and cold. A second later, the warm grin snapped right back into place. People are just like properties. The foundation tells the real story. Now that same rehearsed smile was aimed right at me. 40 years, Langston projected, his voice thick with fake emotion. He looked around the room at the 50 credible witnesses he had gathered. 40 years of building an empire with the love of my life. I kept my posture perfectly straight in my sleek black cocktail dress. My hands were completely steady. I glanced past his shoulder toward the heavy teak console table. His handwritten speech cue cards were resting right next to a silver tray. I could easily read the thick black ink on the final card. The last line read, "To eternity." Langston gestured to the hired waiter standing near the kitchen entrance. "For a milestone this monumental, only the best will do," Langston announced. The waiter stepped forward carrying the 1984 Bordeaux on a silver platter. 2 crystal glasses sat beside the dark, heavy bottle. This was the exact vintage from our wedding year. It was also the year my father expanded the Punta Cana estate. The heavy tannins of this specific wine were chosen for one reason. They were meant to mask the bitter taste of poison. Langston picked up both glasses with steady hands. He didn't tremble at all. I smelled his expensive Tom Ford cologne as he leaned in. He turned to me and extended his right hand. "For you, my darling," he whispered. I took the crystal stem from his fingers. The glass felt heavy and cold against my palm. I looked down at the delicate crystal rim. There it was, a subtle, smeared red wine stain on the outer edge. It was the mark. He had marked the poison glass to ensure he didn't drink it himself. I brought the rim a fraction of an inch closer to my face. A faint, undeniable scent hit the back of my throat. Bitter almonds. It was the sharp chemical smell of pure cyanide. My stomach twisted into a tight, sickening knot. He was really going to do it. He was going to murder me right here in our dining room. I looked out into the sea of elegant guests. Blythe Vance was standing near the terrace doors in her emerald silk blouse. Her hands were clutching that expensive black leather purse. She was waiting for me to collapse onto the hardwood floor. She was waiting for phase 2. The math never lies. They had the forged quitclaim deed for my family's land. They had the $10 million life insurance policy. All they needed was my death certificate. Langston cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention back to him. He held his clean glass of Bordeaux up to the chandelier light. The dark red liquid caught the amber glow. I could feel the 4 new motion sensors tracking us from the ceiling. Their tiny red lenses were recording this entire performance. Langston was building his perfect airtight alibi in real time. He was standing 3 feet away from me. When I died, the footage would show he never touched my drink. It would look like a tragic, sudden medical failure. Exiomara, Langston said, his voice cracking with artificial tears. You're the foundation of my life. I smiled at him. I let all 40 years of my wasted devotion pour into that smile. My thumb brushed against the cold crystal of my poisoned glass. Inside my evening bag, the amber bottle of flunitrazepam was already empty. I had sneaked into the kitchen 10 minutes ago. I found the 2 crystal glasses waiting on the silver platter. I saw the subtle red wine stain on one of the rims. I knew Langston had marked it for me. So I emptied my liquid sedative into the other glass. The clean glass. The one he would confidently keep for himself. Langston thought he was the only one playing a game tonight. He had no idea Mateo was watching the live feed right now. He had no idea his pristine glass of Bordeaux was already spiked. I had laced his drink with enough liquid sedative to drop a horse. But I still had to deal with the cyanide in my own hand. I couldn't just refuse to drink. That would ruin the entire counterplot. I needed him to drink his glass. And I needed an excuse to drop mine. I shifted my weight in my high heels. I positioned the toe of my shoe right against the edge of the thick Persian rug. The 50 guests raised their glasses in unison. The silence in the dining area was suffocating. Langston looked deeply into my eyes. He raised his glass. To my beautiful Shamara, he said smoothly. To eternity. I smiled, holding my poisoned glass. To eternity, Langston. But I didn't drink. I tripped. The toe of my heel caught the edge of the Persian rug. I didn't try to catch myself. I let my body fall hard against the heavy teak dining table. The crystal glass slipped from my fingers. It shattered against the hardwood floor. A dark red stain immediately spread across the antique wool. 50 guests gasped in unison. The clinking of silverware stopped completely. The scent hit me instantly. Bitter almonds, pure concentrated cyanide evaporating into the humid Miami air. My heart hammered against my ribs. I could feel the cold sweat pooling on my neck. Langston rushed toward me. His face was a perfect mask of husbandly concern. Darling, are you all right? He asked. His hands gripped my shoulders tightly. His grip actually bruised my skin. I looked up at him. I feigned absolute, helpless embarrassment. I fluttered my hands over my emerald silk blouse. I'm so clumsy, I stammered. I leaned heavily against the table to push myself up. This was the exact moment. The distraction was absolute perfection. Every single guest was staring at the broken glass on the floor. Dr. Aris was already stepping forward to help. No one was looking at the table surface. I reached my left hand behind the massive bouquet of white lilies. My fingers brushed the cool crystal of a third glass. I had hidden it there 20 minutes ago. It was already filled with the 1984 Bordeaux. It was also heavily laced with lorazepam. In one fluid motion, I swapped it with Langston's glass. Sleight of hand is exactly like a commercial real estate closing. It is all about misdirection. I knew exactly who was watching me. Mateo was recording everything. He was watching the feed from the hidden camera in the dining room chandelier. The timestamp on his screen read 9:15 p.m. He had the only angle that captured the switch. To the 50 guests in the room, I was just a flustered wife. Langston picked up his newly swapped glass. He didn't notice a single thing. He was too busy playing the gracious, forgiving host. He was also terrified of smelling the bitter almonds from the floor. He raised his glass to cover the awkward silence. To my beautiful, clumsy wife, he laughed. The crowd chuckled nervously. I watched his throat work as he took a deep swallow. He drank a quarter of the glass. A dark, triumphant satisfaction bloomed in my chest. The math never lies. The heavy tannins of the Bordeaux completely masked the sedative. I stared at his lips. The warning label from the lorazepam bottle flashed in my mind. May cause severe respiratory depression and paralysis if mixed with alcohol. I had emptied the entire bottle into that single glass. I glanced across the room. Blythe Vance was standing near the terrace doors. She clutched her expensive black leather purse. Her knuckles were completely white. Her eyes were locked on the spilled cyanide. She thought their brilliant murder plan was just delayed. She had no idea the foundation was already crumbling. People are just like properties. The foundation tells the real story. I smoothed my silk skirt. I smiled up at my husband of 40 years. The clock was ticking. Lorazepam acts incredibly fast, especially when introduced to an empty stomach. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. Would you have looked away? I couldn't. I wanted to memorize every second of his downfall. Langston gripped his glass tightly. He adjusted his silk tie with his free hand. He opened his mouth to continue his speech, his brow furrowed in sudden confusion. I saw the exact moment his nervous system began to misfire. His left eyelid twitched violently. A thick bead of sweat rolled down his temple. The smell of his expensive Tom Ford cologne turned sour. He tried to take a step forward. His custom charcoal suit seemed to hang loosely on his frame. I stepped back, giving him plenty of space. I let the audience see the show. I just watched the man who tried to kill me realize he was trapped. His eyes darted wildly toward Blythe. She took a step forward. Her face was completely draining of color. She knew something was terribly wrong. Langston wiped his mouth, annoyed but relieved. 10 seconds later, the glass slipped from his fingers and shattered. His knees buckled. The sound of shattering crystal echoed like a gunshot. 50 guests went completely silent. The jazz music from the hidden speakers kept playing. Then the screaming started. Langston lay rigid on the antique wool Persian rug. His custom charcoal suit was soaked in dark red wine. His eyes were wide open, staring at the crystal chandelier. He couldn't move a single muscle. The heavy dose of lorazepam had locked him inside his own body. I dropped to my knees beside him. The cold, spilled wine soaked right through my silk dress. I let out a blood-curdling shriek. "Somebody help him," I cried out. "He's not breathing right." Dr. Erish shoved his way through the crowd. People in expensive evening wear scrambled backward. Erish dropped next to Langston and pressed 2 fingers to his neck. "His pulse is erratic," Erish shouted. "His breathing is incredibly shallow. Call 911 right now." David, his business partner, pulled out his phone with shaking hands. I looked up from my husband's paralyzed face. I locked eyes directly with Blythe Vance. She was standing frozen by the heavy teak console table. Her emerald silk blouse seemed to lose its color. She stared at the dark stain on the rug. She knew exactly what was happening. The cyanide was supposed to be in my glass. Instead, her wealthy client was suffocating on the floor. I pointed a shaking finger straight at her chest. "She did this!" I screamed, letting tears stream down my face. "She handed him that glass. I saw her." The entire room turned to look at the blonde woman. Blythe took a step back. Her high heel caught the edge of the Persian rug. She gripped her expensive black leather purse tightly against her side. "No," she stammered, her voice cracking. "I didn't. But the math never lies. People are just like properties. The foundation tells the real story." And Mateo had just poured a brand new concrete foundation. My nephew had already executed phase 2 of our plan. He hit send on an anonymous email to the Miami-Dade police. It contained the hacked motion sensor logs from the smart home app. The data showed a perfect fabricated timeline. It proved Langston was in the kitchen for 10 minutes. It showed Blythe was entirely alone in the dining room with the drinks. It framed her perfectly for spiking the 1984 Bordeaux. Blythe turned and bolted toward the marble foyer. She didn't even make it to the heavy mahogany front door. Sirens were already wailing down Brickell Avenue. Red and blue lights strobed through the floor-to-ceiling penthouse windows. 3 squad cars and an ambulance had pulled up in record time. The police cruiser dash cams caught the chaotic arrival outside. Heavy boots pounded down the main hallway. The front door burst open. Miami police officers flooded into the marble foyer. At exactly 9:22 p.m., the indoor security camera captured the arrest. Two officers violently tackled Blythe to the cold floor. Her black purse spilled open on impact. A small glass vial rolled out across the white tiles. It was the leftover cyanide. An officer snapped heavy metal handcuffs onto her wrists. She was screaming about a setup, begging them to check the cameras. Nobody was listening. Back in the dining room, the paramedics pushed past me. They hauled Langston's rigid body onto a yellow backboard. He wasn't dead. The respiratory depression from the sedative was severe, but he was breathing. He was entirely conscious. He could see his empire crumbling right in front of him. He could hear the police dragging his accomplice away. He knew his forged quitclaim deed was utterly worthless now. The Punta Cana estate was permanently locked in a blind trust, and he couldn't even blink to defend himself. The smell of his expensive Tom Ford cologne mixed with the metallic scent of sheer panic. I leaned over the stretcher as they strapped his chest down. My face was inches from his ear. I smoothed his silk tie with my thumb. As the paramedics loaded him onto the stretcher, his eyes locked onto mine, wide with terror. I leaned in and whispered, "Happy anniversary, mi amor." The sun is rising over the Atlantic Ocean in Punta Cana. I am sitting on the mahogany terrace of my father's estate. The air is thick with the scent of salt and blooming hibiscus. It is a far cry from the sterile hospital room in Miami. I take a slow sip of my black coffee. It is hot, bitter, and exactly what I need. My iPad sits on the wrought iron table in front of me. The screen is bright in the early morning light. I am looking at a digital clipping from the Miami Herald. The headline is bold and black. Miami socialite fixer sentenced to 20 years for bizarre poisoning plot. Blythe Vance looks smaller in her orange jumpsuit. Her eyes are hollow and devoid of their usual shark-like glint. She tried to play a high-stakes game with my life. Now she is playing for cigarettes in a federal cell. The math never lies. Langston's fate is much quieter, but infinitely more poetic. He is currently residing in a high-end long-term care facility. It costs $18,000 a month. I signed the checks myself. The paralysis from the flunitrazepam eventually faded. His body recovered, but his mind never quite made it back. The doctors call it a profound psychological break. I call it a permanent vacation from his own lies. He can move his hands now. He can even whisper a few words. But he cannot touch a single cent of my inheritance. The durable power of attorney I gave to Mateo is ironclad. I remember that afternoon it seemed 6 months ago. I remember seeing Langston lean in to kiss Blythe. The memory feels like a scene from a movie I barely watched. It is distant and pathetic. I look down at my hands. They are steady as I scroll through the trust documents. I am officially the sole executor of the Punta Cana estate. The beachfront is finally safe. I spent 40 years building a life with a ghost. I spent 40 years being an asset on his balance sheet. Now I am the one holding the ledger. I stand up and walk to the edge of the stone railing. The white sand stretches out for miles. My feet are bare on the cool tiles. I can feel my heartbeat, slow and rhythmic. I am 64 years old and I am finally starting my life. My father would have loved this view. He would have loved that I kept what he built. I pick up my iPad and close the news app. There is no more room for them in my head. I have a meeting with the architects at 10. We are expanding the guest house for Mateo. He is arriving on the afternoon flight from Miami. The house is full of flowers. The cellar is stocked with fresh wine. Not the 1984 Bordeaux. I had these bottles poured into the Atlantic. I watch the turquoise water crash against the rocks. The sound is a constant, soothing roar. It drowns out the ghosts of Brickell Avenue. People are just like properties. The foundation tells the real story. Langston's foundation was made of sand. Mine was made of the very rock I am standing on. He tried to bury me to take my kingdom. Now he's trapped in a hospital bed watching me spend his money. The math never lies. If this story hit you, drop a like right now. Hit that subscribe button to hear more of how I took it all back. Turn on those notifications and hit that bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below. I read every single one of them. Where are you watching this from right now? What time is it there as you hear my voice? I want to know who is listening.